Welcome to Buddha's Healing, a gentle place where we quietly reflect on the wisdom of the Buddha and learn how to soften suffering, heal the heart, and rediscover peace in every season of life. Dear friends, there comes a season of life after 65 when many people begin paying closer attention to their health. Blood pressure, sleep, energy levels, aches and pains, medical appointments, changes in the body. And naturally, this is understandable, because the body speaks more clearly as the years pass. But dear friends, what if some of the heaviness we feel is not only physical? What if the heart has been carrying something too? Something invisible, something emotional, something heavy. For many years, people often focus on what they eat, how much they exercise, how well they sleep. Yet few people stop to ask, what emotional burdens have I been carrying? Because sometimes the body grows tired, not only from age, but from emotional weight. Worry, fear, resentment, loneliness, regret. The endless pressure to keep carrying everything alone. Please hear this gently. The Buddha understood that the mind and body are deeply connected. When the heart suffers quietly, the body often feels it too. Not because emotions cause every illness, but because emotional burdens quietly drain energy, interrupt peace, disturb sleep, increase tension, and make life feel heavier than it needs to be. Today, we are going to gently reflect on 6 emotional burdens many people over 65 continue carrying, burdens that quietly affect health, happiness, and inner peace. Not to create fear, not to assign blame, but to create awareness, because awareness is where healing begins. Together, we will gently explore old regret that never fully healed, constant worry about family and the future, resentment that quietly lives inside the heart, the pressure to make everyone else happy, loneliness hidden beneath strength, fear about aging and uncertainty, and perhaps most importantly, how the Buddha's path of letting go helps the heart become lighter. Please hear this gently. This reflection is not about giving up. It is not about pretending pain never existed. It is simply about asking, what no longer belongs in my heart? Because perhaps the body is asking for rest, and perhaps the heart is too. So before we continue, take one slow breath. Let your shoulders soften, and gently ask yourself, what have I been carrying that quietly hurts? Because sometimes the first step toward healing is simply noticing how heavy the burden has become. Dear friends, let us gently begin with the first emotional burden that quietly harms health after 65, one that many people carry for years without realizing how heavy it has become. And that burden is old regret that never fully healed. Please hear this gently. Almost every person reaches a point in life where they look back, not because they want to live in the past, but because the heart naturally reflects. Especially after 65, the mind revisits old chapters, old decisions, old relationships, moments that unfolded differently than hoped, and sometimes a quiet question begins appearing more often. What if I had done things differently? What if I had said the right thing? What if I had chosen another path? Dear friends, how exhausting regret quietly becomes when carried for too long, especially when it turns into self-punishment. Night after night, year after year, the same memories, the same judgments, the same emotional replay. Please hear this gently. Regret itself is not the problem. Regret can teach. Regret can guide. Regret can awaken wisdom. The suffering begins when regret stops teaching and starts hurting. Because the body listens to emotional pain, the nervous system listens, sleep listens, energy listens, and a heart constantly reliving old mistakes rarely feels peaceful. The Buddha gently reminded people, the past cannot be changed, but suffering grows when we continue arguing with what already happened. Today we gently reflect on something important. How much energy has old regret quietly taken from your life? The Buddha often taught about attachment. Not only attachment to pleasure, but attachment to painful memories. How often does this happen? Someone remembers an old mistake, and immediately the body tightens, the chest feels heavy, the mind returns years backward, as though the event happened yesterday. The heart whispers, I should have known better, I failed, I cannot forgive myself. And dear friends, perhaps many people spend decades carrying a younger version of themselves like a burden, judging, criticizing, punishing, forgetting something important. The younger version of you was also human, also learning, also struggling, also trying. Please hear this gently. The purpose of reflection is growth, not lifelong punishment. Emotionally healthy people slowly begin learning something healing. Wisdom grows when regret becomes compassion, not shame, compassion. Imagine carrying a suitcase filled with old mistakes everywhere you go, for years, for decades. Eventually, the shoulders ache, walking feels harder, rest feels harder, joy feels farther away. Dear friends, perhaps many people quietly assume this is just life, but perhaps part of the heaviness comes from carrying memories that no longer need to be carried this way. Please hear this gently. You do not need to erase the past. You do not need to deny what happened. But perhaps you can stop reopening the wound every day, especially now, because healing matters, peace matters, and your heart deserves kindness too. Perhaps tonight, you may gently ask yourself, what regret have I carried too long? What lesson has it already taught me? Can I stop punishing myself? Because sometimes, healing begins not when the memory disappears. Sometimes, healing begins the moment compassion finally arrives. There was a woman named Helen. She was 70 years old, living quietly in a small town outside Wisconsin. Most people who knew Helen described her as kind, thoughtful, gentle, the type of person who always remembered birthdays, always sent thank you cards, always tried to make others feel cared for. Yet quietly, Helen carried something heavy, something no one else could see, a regret she had been carrying for more than 20 years. It involved her younger sister, Patricia. When they were in their 40s, the two sisters had a painful disagreement. At first, it seemed small, a misunderstanding, a few harsh words, some hurt feelings. But pride quietly entered the situation. Neither sister reached out, neither apologized. Weeks became months, months became years, and somehow, the distance grew. Then life happened. Children grew older, jobs changed, families moved, time passed. Before either of them realized it, more than a decade had gone by. Then one day, Patricia passed away unexpectedly after a brief illness, and suddenly, the opportunity Helen always assumed would still exist was gone. The apology, the conversation, the chance to sit together and say, I miss you. For years afterward, Helen replayed the story endlessly. At night, during quiet afternoons, while looking through old photographs, the same thoughts always returned. Why didn't I call? Why didn't I let it go? Why was I so stubborn? The regret became a constant companion, not loud, not dramatic, just quietly present, like a stone in her pocket, always there. One afternoon, while having tea with her friend Martha, Helen unexpectedly began talking about Patricia. At first, she smiled while sharing childhood stories. Then, suddenly, her eyes filled with tears. I still think about her every day. Martha reached across the table. What hurts the most? Helen looked down. I never said I was sorry. The room became quiet. Then Martha softly asked, do you think Patricia would want you suffering for the rest of your life? The question lingered, because honestly, Helen had never thought about it that way. Weeks later, she attended a mindfulness class at a local community center. One afternoon, the teacher softly said, many people believe regret honors the past, but endless self-punishment only prolongs suffering. Helen sat very still. Then came another sentence, a sentence she would never forget. If a lesson has already been learned, the heart no longer needs punishment. Something shifted, because suddenly, Helen realized something painful. For years, she had confused guilt with love, as though continuing to suffer somehow proved how much Patricia mattered. But perhaps, love did not require lifelong punishment. Perhaps love could become compassion. That evening, Helen sat quietly by the window with an old photograph of her sister. For the first time in years, she whispered softly, I was wrong. Then, after a pause, and I forgive myself. Tears came, gentle tears, not of despair, but of release. The kind of tears that arrive when the heart finally stops fighting. Slowly, things changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, just gently. She stopped replaying the story every day, started focusing on the love they had shared, allowed gratitude to exist beside sorrow, and little by little, the stone she carried grew lighter. Months later, Martha smiled during lunch. You seem more peaceful lately. Helen laughed softly. I think I finally learned something. What? After a long pause, Helen quietly answered, regret taught me what mattered, but it was never meant to become my home. Dear friends, perhaps there is a Helen somewhere inside many of us, someone carrying an old regret, someone wishing they could revisit a moment, someone quietly punishing themselves for something that cannot be changed. Please hear this gently. Regret can be a teacher, but it should not become a prison. Because, dear friends, the lesson has already been learned, the wisdom has already been received, and perhaps now, the heart deserves compassion. Perhaps tonight, you may gently ask yourself, what regret have I carried long enough? What has it already taught me? Can I finally let kindness enter? Because sometimes, healing begins not when the past changes. Sometimes, healing begins when we stop asking the heart to suffer forever. If today's reflection touched your heart, please subscribe to Buddha's Healing and continue walking this journey of mindfulness, healing, and inner peace with us. And if there is a regret you have quietly carried for years, perhaps gently leave a comment below. Sometimes healing begins when we realize we are not alone in our human mistakes. Dear friends, let us gently move into the second emotional burden that quietly harms health after 65. One that many loving people carry every single day without realizing how exhausting it has become. And that burden is constant worry about family and the future. Please hear this gently. Worry often comes from a beautiful place. Love, concern, responsibility, the desire to protect people we care about, especially after 65. Because even when children become adults, many parents never stop being parents. Even when grandchildren grow older, the heart still watches over them. Even when life changes, love remains. And because love remains, worry often remains too. Perhaps some people listening today understand this deeply. You worry about your children, their finances, their health, their relationships, their future. You worry about grandchildren. You worry about the world they are growing up in. You worry about your own health, your future, your family's future. And somehow, the mind quietly carries these concerns every day. Please hear this gently. Caring is natural. Love is beautiful, but endless worry quietly becomes heavy, very heavy, because the body does not always know the difference between a real danger and an imagined one. The nervous system responds, the heart responds, sleep responds, energy responds, and over time, the emotional weight quietly accumulates. Today, we gently reflect on something important. When does caring become emotional exhaustion? The Buddha gently reminded people, not everything belongs to us to carry. Not every outcome, not every future, not every possibility. And dear friends, this can be difficult to accept. Because naturally, we want the people we love to be safe, happy, protected. But how often does worry actually create peace? A parent lies awake imagining problems. A grandparent spends hours fearing future hardships. A loved one constantly prepares for worst-case scenarios. And somehow, the suffering happens before anything has even happened. The Buddha taught that much of human suffering comes from attachment to imagined futures. The mind says, "What if?" Again and again. What if something goes wrong? What if life becomes harder? What if I cannot protect them? What if I lose control? And dear friends, the heart quietly grows tired, carrying futures that do not yet exist. Emotionally healthy people slowly begin learning something freeing. Love does not require carrying every fear. You can care deeply without carrying everything. You can support people without suffering on their behalf every night. You can love without living inside worst-case scenarios. Imagine carrying a backpack filled with rocks. One rock for every worry. One rock for every imagined problem. One rock for every future fear. At first, perhaps it feels manageable. But after years, the weight becomes exhausting. Dear friends, perhaps some of the heaviness people feel after 65 is not coming from life itself. Perhaps it comes from carrying too many futures at once. Please hear this gently. You are allowed to trust life a little more. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to stop carrying every possibility. Especially now, because peace matters, health matters, and your heart matters too. Perhaps tonight, you may gently ask yourself, what future fear have I been carrying? What worry no longer belongs to me? Can I trust life a little more? Because sometimes, healing begins not when uncertainty disappears. Sometimes, healing begins when we stop demanding certainty from life. There was a man named Edward. He was 72 years old, living quietly with his wife, Rose, in a small town outside Oregon. From the outside, Edward seemed like a calm man, retired, financially stable, surrounded by family. The kind of grandfather who attended soccer games, remembered birthdays, and always brought extra snacks for the grandchildren. But quietly, Edward carried something heavy, something he rarely spoke about. Worry. Constant worry, not about himself, about everyone else. His daughter's marriage, his son's finances, his grandson's future, the rising cost of living, the economy, the world, his health, their health. And somehow, no matter what problem was solved, another one appeared. Every morning began with concern. Every evening ended with concern. And at night, the worries grew louder. Rose noticed it first. One evening, while sitting on the porch, she softly asked, "Do you ever stop worrying?" Edward laughed. "Not really. What are you worried about now?" He smiled sadly. "Everything." The answer came easily, because honestly, it felt true. Everything. The future seemed full of things that could go wrong, and Edward felt responsible for preparing for all of them. Weeks later, his daughter Emily came to visit. During dinner, she said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you know what stresses me out sometimes?" Edward looked surprised. "What? You worrying about me?" The room became quiet. Emily smiled gently. I know you love me, but sometimes I feel like you're carrying problems I don't even have. The sentence lingered, because somehow it felt painfully accurate. That evening, Edward sat alone in the living room, thinking about what she had said. For years, he had believed worry was love, as though worrying more meant caring more, as though carrying fear somehow protected the people he loved. But did it? The answer was uncomfortable. Not really. A few weeks later, at a mindfulness gathering, the teacher softly said, "Many people mistake fear for responsibility." Edward sat very still. Then came another sentence, a sentence that seemed written specifically for him. "The future has never asked you to carry it alone." Something shifted, because suddenly he realized how much of his life had been spent mentally, living in tomorrow, preparing, predicting, protecting, rarely resting, rarely trusting. Then the teacher gently added, "Love supports, fear controls." The words stayed with him. That evening, before bed, the familiar worries appeared again. But this time, Edward tried something different. He whispered softly, "I care deeply." Pause. "But I cannot carry every future." Then another breath. "And tonight, I choose rest." Nothing dramatic happened. The worries did not disappear, but something softened. The grip, the urgency, the need to solve everything immediately. Slowly, things changed. Not perfectly, not overnight, just gently. He spent less time imagining worst-case scenarios, more time enjoying family dinners, more time appreciating present moments, more time trusting the people he loved. And little by little, the emotional weight became lighter. Months later, Rose smiled one morning over coffee. "You seem more peaceful lately." Edward laughed softly. "I think I finally realized something." "What?" He looked out the window, then quietly said, "Worrying never gave me control. It only stole my peace." Dear friends, perhaps there is an Edward somewhere inside many of us. Someone carrying future fears, someone worrying endlessly about loved ones, someone confusing emotional burden with love. Please hear this gently. You can love deeply without carrying every fear. You can care without exhausting yourself. You can support people without living inside imagined disasters. Because, dear friends, the future has never asked you to suffer in advance. And perhaps your heart deserves rest too. Perhaps tonight, you may gently ask yourself, what future am I trying to control? What fear have I carried too long? What would trust feel like? Because sometimes, healing begins the moment we softly whisper, "I care deeply, but I no longer need to carry tomorrow tonight." Dear friends, as we gently come to the end of today's reflection, perhaps the most important truth resting beneath everything we explored is this: the heart was never meant to carry everything. Not forever, not alone, not without rest. Today, we gently reflected on emotional burdens that quietly harm health after 65. Old regret that never fully healed, constant worry about family and the future, resentment carried for years, the pressure to keep everyone happy, loneliness hidden behind strength, fear about aging, illness, and uncertainty. These burdens are often invisible. No one sees them. No doctor can easily measure them. Yet the heart feels them. The mind feels them. The body often feels them too. Please hear this gently. You are not weak for feeling emotionally tired. You are not failing. You are not broken. Because life after 65 often carries decades of memories, responsibilities, losses, disappointments, goodbyes, and countless moments that quietly shaped the heart. Dear friends, you have carried much, perhaps more than anyone truly knows. The sacrifices, the worries, the grief, the sleepless nights, the endless effort to protect people you love. And perhaps no one has said this to you recently. You deserve peace too. The Buddha gently reminded people, suffering often grows when we keep holding what life is asking us to release. Not because love is wrong, not because caring is wrong, but because carrying too much eventually exhausts the spirit. And perhaps after 65, life quietly asks a different question. Not, how much more can I carry? But gently, what can I finally set down? Because, dear friends, healing rarely begins with adding more. Often, healing begins with releasing. Less regret, less resentment, less fear, less worry, less emotional burden. Little by little, breath by breath, day by day. Please hear this gently. You do not need to stop loving. You do not need to stop caring. You do not need to stop remembering. But perhaps you no longer need to suffer quite so much, especially now, because peace matters, rest matters, and your heart matters too. Perhaps tonight, before sleep, you may place a hand gently over your heart. Take one slow breath and quietly ask yourself, what burden have I been carrying too long? What no longer belongs in this season of my life? What would it feel like to finally set it down? Because sometimes healing begins with one small act of courage, not holding tighter, but letting go. If today's reflection brought even a small sense of comfort, please subscribe to Buddha's Healing and continue walking this journey of mindfulness, healing, and inner peace with us. And if there is an emotional burden your heart has quietly carried for years, perhaps gently share it in the comments. Sometimes healing begins when we realize we are not carrying life alone. May your burdens grow lighter. May your heart grow softer. And may peace gently return to you, one quiet breath at a time.